Alrighty, so I've spent a little time this morning after I looked at the submissions last night, which seems like everyone got the idea and got their code working and was able to make the API to the one I recommend, that one I provided, which was the JSON placeholder API, which was awesome, and doing it with callbacks and using that was it XML HTTP request. And the reason I like this progression, as I've said before, is it really is, as you do more of this, you may be looking at somebody else's code, and there are still many examples of people using that mechanism, that protocol for making API calls. But now we're going to see in this week, in week 16, is actually taking both the promises and the async await. As I was talking about this before, I kept thinking there were different weeks, but what I was remembering was when I taught this, when I was teaching Node.js, we did that. So this week, week 16, is the week where you actually are going to refactor making that API call to using fetch and using promises and async await. So it's very different syntax, but it's doing the same thing. Okay. So one of the things I want to talk about was I put out a message on Discord. So hopefully you saw it. If you didn't, check out Discord or ask me for it. Or I might just link it here below, where I looked at the example from Motson of how to do a class for both your data inputs, instantiation of those objects, and then how to just use a class to hold methods that are just static methods. So check that out if your path to Dev 2 is the class implementation. So have any questions about that, check it out. So at this point, though, now given where we're looking at for week 16, and actually here is the week we finish coding along with the Andrew Mead's course, the bootcamp course on Udemy. And actually, one of the things I'd love to hear from you is I'm actually considering a new Udemy course that is a 2021 course. So obviously you couldn't give me that comparison, but just your general feedback about, the amount of content and the content that we used from Udemy. Because there's a part of me that thinks I'll just continue using it, but then I'm like, no, actually there is some things that I feel like could have been brought up to date, but it's such a good deal. Anyway, I won't head down that track. I just want to, have you think about that in your feedback this week. So what I want to say, and in week 17, because we don't have the Udemy course, I allow you to choose an hour of content. So one of the things you could do here is there's some good content out there that talk more about the classes and how to approach those concepts, right? And give you examples. That's one thing you could choose if that's your Dev 2. So what I would do if I was you is I would make a decision about what options, because I've talked about on the Dev 2, the options, right? Right, using, and again, the video I created and put out on Discord was covering this first option. And then if your second option is actually finding an API, I want to talk just a little more about this today, because the one thing that can happen, and let me just give you my general process of doing this. If your path to Dev 2 is just walking away from what you did with Dev 1 or using part of it, I think I've talked to Fabian, and he was going to actually go ahead and use the code he had for Dev 1 and then integrate an API call, which is fine. So whichever path you choose, if you choose the second one, then there's a couple things I recommend. A is start looking for that API now, because APIs, and I'll show you my example of my Dev 2 using the API call in a minute. But one of the things you have to there's a couple of things, many APIs now are unfortunately moving behind paywalls. So the more popular the API, the more likely you're going to have to pay for it. And that's not the intention of this class. I don't want you to do that. But I want you to know the reason you want to start, the sooner you start looking, the better, is that you can find one that hopefully is not behind a paywall. But will probably require, most of them do these days that are of any significance, an API key. Like if you were going to use the geolocation for Google Maps, you would need to register an API key with them. And that is just a process that they provide on their site. You register for their site, you get their API key. So that's like, first find it, register your API key. The third thing you have to do is figure out, based on hopefully their documentation, because part of what would make me select an API is how well their site documents how to use it. Because the better documented it is, the more helpful it's going to be. It should give you some code examples to get you started. Because here's the deal, making these API calls, let's say using async await, which you're going to learn this week, right? There's this challenge when you're doing it from client side. So we are writing client side JavaScript. There is a server side, that's a Node.js course. But when you're writing it from the Java client side, there is sometimes a hurdle to overcome with using the same domain, a core. It's called CORS, and it's basically a security issue around these APIs, wanting to make sure they're more secure and who hits the API keys and how the data gets brought back. So I just want you to know that I've had a student last semester end up having to change the way they made the call to something called JSON-P, which is just another technology to try to help kind of you get around this idea of the cross-site origin scripting problem. So, and I'm not saying you'll run into it. You may not. But the sooner you take a look at it and you see if this is the one you want to use, you start setting up, getting your API key, and then figuring out what the code looks like. It's quite a few steps. So the sooner you get kind of in that process, the better it's going to be. Okay. So, and then of course the last option, which is just to, based on what we've covered so far, come up and pitch an idea to me. But I have also set a deadline for that of May 10th. So, and here we are, right, at the last day of April, heading into May this weekend. So time is coming, we are coming to the end. We're now in week 6, we've finished 15, right? That's the one that I graded last night, or from last night. So now you're into 16. And I will tell you again, I'm going to run the video from last semester. So when I get in, this is a little like when you're watching the video for week 16, as I start talking about the dev, you could probably just skip that, because I have updated it this semester with a better example of how to handle path 1. And now I'm going to talk about path 2. So I'm just going to give you that heads up. Okay. So for my dev 2, I ended up looking at a COVID API to actually get some both the number of hospitalizations and you'll see it here in a second. So the number in ICU and the number that tested positive. So the API call wasn't actually that bad. What I ended up doing, though, in addition to this, and this is part of what I want you to think about, is it's one thing to make the API call and get that data back, as you've seen now with both the Hangman and now with the JSON placeholder. And you'll see it next week. But the other thing you need to do is handle that data coming back in a way that, and that's what I say in the requirements, that, give that either some additional functionality or just some styling. So what I ended up doing was using a library called D3, which D3 is a very popular library for the browser for the client side JavaScript in order to graph things. So what you can see I did here is that I put a couple of buttons so that I could say, well, let's look at those are the positive cases. And the D3, once I just passed it the data and gave it to it in the format that it wanted, I think I ended up having to do some reverse on it. But it showed the most current data over here, and this is the number of cases that are actually number of folks in ICU. So this was fun. So not only did I have to figure out how to make the API call, I also had to figure out how to do D3. So together, those were really fun things to figure out, but they did take me a little bit of time. So that's my example of doing that. But interesting enough today, it's kind of in the vein I was talking about. Now they require you to get an API key. Okay. Now, it's not that it's hard to do that. That's actually not that bad to get an API key. You just have to register for it. And then you have to figure out, and you can see actually here, I wrote an await called fetch and gave it the API. What we call these endpoints, right? The URL that represents when your browser, right, makes that call, makes that a reference, then it's like, in combination most likely with an API key, then it brings that data back and you have to figure out how and what you're going to do with that data. Now I had to convert it, and I'm sitting here looking at here, convert it to a JSON format. Then I had to go through the data, push it into an array, and then pass it into the chart. So that's how I ended up doing that. And again, it was fun. It was a great experience to do that. So that is my example of just one of the ways how I approached this part here. Okay. So my additional functionality in this case was actually putting buttons to then display different kinds of data. So this is a good experience. Come see me if you need help. Like I said, next week is our last week to cover Andrew Mead's class. Any feedback you'd like to give me about Andrew Mead's class, and if you're wondering what class I'm actually thinking about, can I find it? I have to go back to Udemy. I actually haven't purchased it yet as well, but it's a JavaScript Bootcamp 2021. Let me just search for that and see if I can find it. Not Maximilian's course either. Stephen, it's actually, here it is, Colt Steele, who's awesome. And Stephen Greiner, who I've actually used another course for another class. I really like this course, and of course it's not 89; it's less than that. But that's the course I'm actually thinking of switching from Andrew Mead's class. And honestly, because I wish Andrew would update this, but I'm starting to run the risk, because this has happened to me before, that if I don't switch to a newer course in the middle of a semester, because I had it happen once, so I guess I'm burned. I had one of the Udemy instructors completely redo the course, which was awesome. They did an in-place update, so that means people who already had it got all the new content, but it did create quite a mess in my course. And I just like using different people and seeing their style. So part of my project this summer will actually be to go through this course enough to where I say, yeah, that's the course I'm going to use, and then plan it out. But I also need to do this for Python, and I need to do it for my machine learning class. So it's going to be a fun summer for me. Anyway, enough blah, blah. Have a good weekend. I'll talk to you later.